In this video, I'm going to be talking about the logic of natural selection, how Darwin was able to piece together various observations and make various inferences in order to come up with a picture for how natural selection was going to work. So this is how Darwin's thought process appeared to work. It's actually a reconstruction of Darwin's thought process, or rather a framework for understanding the key components of Darwin's thought process that's actually due to another scientist, Ernst Mayr. So here we're going to start off with just a survey. This is actually a picture of Ernst Mayr as a young man in the early 20th century off surveying someplace tropical. So we're going to go with Ernst Mayr and first survey the general ways that Darwin thought about and the evidence Darwin used for natural selection, and then in subsequent videos we'll dive into each part of Darwin's logic. First, it always needs to be reiterated that evolution is defined as changes in allele frequencies. Natural selection is just one mechanism by which evolution can happen. So that means natural selection is just one way that allele frequencies can change. But it's a very exciting and interesting one because it's a way that organisms can adapt, that rather populations can adapt over time, and many of the wonderful, fabulous things we see in our world and see in nature are due to the operation of natural selection. So the process of natural selection can be broken down into a series of components. This was done by this scientist, Ernst Mayr. He was looking back at Darwin's writing and came up with a framework for the important pieces that Darwin used. He broke it down into 8 steps, another number of observations that Darwin used, and then inferences he made, logical steps based off of those pieces of evidence. In other books, many authors will use fewer steps. Ernst Mayr has kind of the broadest, most complete picture. So a key exercise to try to do is to look in your textbook or look at another source and see how their framework matches up with Mayr's more step-by-step framework. So the process can be broken down into a series of components. This is from Gregory 2009. Highly recommend reading this article. Gregory made this picture, which shows a number of observations here. They feed into a logical step, some inferences made, and then a final inference about the operation of natural selection. There are a series of ecological observations, and then there's also a series of genetic components, a series of genetic observations. Now, Darwin didn't know the ins and outs of genetics, and Mendelian genetics was a long time coming after Darwin, but he had observations about heredity worked and intuitions about how genetics worked. So again, this is made up of some key observations, things that Darwin and his contemporaries could observe about the natural world, and also inferences. Darwin inferring, Darwin working out the consequences of those observations, so thinking it through. Now for Darwin, these were inferences. We have since accumulated substantial experimental evidence for how all of these observations are ubiquitous, and these inferences, we can actually demonstrate them in the laboratory and in the field, how they actually operate. So there's 3 ecological observations. They have to do with the ability for populations to grow. That's observation 1. Observation 2 is the fact that you go out in nature, and while populations tend to grow, they're often stable. You go out one day, there's a certain number of trees in your backyard. You go out the next day, there's the same number. There's always a handful of squirrels in my yard. There's never millions. There's never just 1 or 2. There's always 4 or 5 that I see every day running around. Also, another observation is that natural resources are limited. The squirrels in my yard eat the acorns and the nuts, and there's only a certain number of those. The trees only produce a certain number each year, so resources are limited. There's also two genetics observations, or rather hereditary observations, that Darwin made, since he didn't have a full understanding of genetics at the time. And that's it. There's variation among individuals. Individuals within a populations are not all identical. The squirrels and the birds in my yard, I can look at them and I can see that some are healthier than others, some are bigger than others, some appear to be faster, some look like they're smarter. I can see the squirrels solving problems and getting into my bird feeders. So some are better at solving those problems, some aren't. So there's variation, and then also many characteristics, many traits are heritable. This observation was primarily carried out in Darwin's time through breeding organisms and seeing how in farm animals and in pets, the characteristics, an animal resembled its parents. Same thing in humans. Darwin then, starting with these observations, he then took a step, and we'll talk more about this in subsequent videos, but he wove together these three observations and said that even though the fact that that populations can grow exponentially, there are limited resources, and this limit of resources creates the stability we see, and the fact that there are limited resources means there's a struggle for existence. Organisms must be trying to gather more resources than the other organisms of the population. They're all trying to outcompete each other in order to be the ones that survive rather than those that die. There's also another inference that Marr lays out, which is this is where ecology meets genetics. And this is the inference that some of this ability to survive, this ability to successfully struggle and survive, to be part of the population that makes it to the next year, some of that is the ability to do that is variable, and that variability is heritable. So those that survive, that win at the struggle for existence, that survive to the next year, they're able to, some of the reasons they're able to do that has to do with genetic reasons, and they're going to pass that on to their offspring. And then the final inference that Marr lays out, that Darwin made, is that since differences in survival and reproductions vary between individuals, it's non-random. Those that survive are going to pass their traits on at higher rates to their offspring, and so their offspring are going to possess those traits. Those offspring are going to pass those traits on to their successfully surviving and breeding offspring, and so forth. And that means that the traits that are useful for winning in the struggle for existence, those are going to increase in frequency, and that's the mechanism of evolution by natural selection. So this was just a broad overview, a survey of these topics, the way Marr lays out the logic that Darwin came up with. In a subsequent video, I will unpack these separate sets of observations and inferences.